Hey, what's up guys, and welcome back to another Reddit Stories video. This video will cover Reddit serial killer encounters, so pretty spooky and scary, but it'll be interesting to get into, so make sure you stick around. So make sure you sit back, relax, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. It's the channel's goal to be at 250,000 subs by the end of the year, and I really think we can do it, so please consider subscribing. And alright, anyways, let's get into the first story. I went to a serial killer's lair. Hello Redditors, here's a story I have never told anyone, partly because elements of the story are just not appropriate in most social situations. As a result, I've locked this away in my memory, and I rarely think about it. Fair warning, the story does involve some sketchy situations, but does not describe any SAs. And as another disclaimer, I am completely aware that this story involves me being very stupid and careless. I'm not going to inject these acknowledgments into the story, but rest assured that in hindsight, I'm aware of the foolishness that took place. I don't need to be chided on that topic. Now, where to begin? This year was approximately 1998 to 1999. I was a young gay man in my early 20s, living in a medium-sized city in the Midwestern US. This was sort of an in-between, transitional time for gay people, where in most populous areas we had enough respect to live openly, but were still plenty of people who did not like us. It was well before the invention of smartphones, and the internet was still in the early stages of mass adoption. There were large communities online, but it was not yet at the point where most Americans were online. Online socialization consisted of chat rooms hosted by various services like AOL, Yahoo, or IRC servers, and message boards were still in use by large numbers of people. For gay men at that time, it was nothing short of revolutionary. Prior to the internet and to the broader cultural changes, gay men had been stuck looking for fun in secretive and or shady places due to the inability to freely express ourselves. In the 90s, it was still somewhat risky, but the internet offered a way to talk freely and relatively anonymously, without the risk of being outed or worse. For this reason, it really took off in the gay communities, and gay men were a very large part of the user base for these social platforms. It was suddenly very easy and relatively safe to find dates, friends, or just sex, and it quickly became the norm for a lot of gay men. On the other hand, being such a new communication tool for most people, we were sometimes blind to the risks. Being an attractive young man in my prime, I made liberal use of online communities to find dates. That is to say, I had plenty of hookups. My city had a decent number of chat rooms and personal message boards, and I had mostly great experiences. I met the typical assortment of good guys, closet cases, and weirdos that you'd expect. I wasn't an absolute hoe by most standards, but suffice to say, a cute gay guy at the time would generally have a lot more dates than your typical straight person, lol. At some point during this time, I'd have some brief chat on a message board with a guy from my city. I forget his screen name, it's been over 20 years, so let's call him Slim Guy 65. This back and forth had happened on a general thread in the gay section, not in the private messages, so it was visible to anyone who chose to read that thread. Nothing had come of it, but about a week later I received an email from an unrecognized address. The email basically said, "Hey, I'm not gay and I don't agree with the gay lifestyle. I'm here because my friend met this Slim Guy 65 person from this message board, and the guy really hurt him. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. My friend tried to tell the police, but they wouldn't do anything. I see you were talking to Slim Guy 65, so just be careful and stay away from him." Okay, that's strange. What does this person mean by really hurt him? Was his heart broken? Did he get beaten up or verbally abused or what? I responded to the email asking for a clarification on what exactly happened. I never received a response. I was slightly weirded out by it, but on the other hand, it's an anonymous email from someone who doesn't respond and is vague about their warning. This could be anything. It could be a very disgruntled ex trying to mess with the guy. It could be a real warning about someone gay bashing. It could be someone trolling who doesn't have anything to do with anyone. I kept it in the back of my mind, but pretty much shrugged it off. Several weeks later, I had a weekday off work and decided to take on to the internet to fish for some D. As was my custom, lo and behold, I had an email response to a personal ad. It was Slim Guy 65. He was offering to meet me at his place to hang out and just have a good time. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I won't go into details, and as I recall, there weren't really many details discussed other than the small talk and intros we'd done previously. Nothing about this guy was really sounding interesting to me, but I had no other offers on this day. So I decided, why not? I'll go see what this dude is about. As I typed my reply, I suddenly remembered the strange email I'd received warning about this person. I went back and reread it. It still vague, still presenting more questions and no answers. Should I take this anonymous warning at face value and just ignore SG65? I decided to go check him out anyway. His address was on a rather busy street in the middle of a dense residential area, so not some shack in the woods. And I can handle myself. If he's weird, I can just get the fuck out of there. Before long, I arrived at the house at the agreed time. It was a duplex-style house with one apartment on the ground floor and one on the second floor, part of a row of several identical duplexes. It was the middle of the afternoon. There was plenty of traffic on the street and the occasional person on their porch or in their backyard. I pulled up on the driveway to the parking area behind the house, got out, and knocked on the door. The guy that answered was a pretty normal, kind of mousy-looking man, probably in his 40s. Slight, slim build, soft-spoken, looked like any guy working in an office cubicle somewhere. Not really my type, but honestly my curiosity was piqued and I had nothing better to do. So I stepped inside to take a look around and gauge the situation. With the warning email fresh in my mind, I stepped into the back door, into the kitchen. It was very clean and there was nothing out on the counters, and no table and chairs or anything. That is to say, it did not look like someone was living there. It had been kept and cleaned, but it looked empty. Looking out into the apartment, I could see that it was not set up as a living space. A large window with sliding glass was between the kitchen and the living room, and I could see what looked like a large table out in the living room area. SG65 said something like, "This isn't where I live. A friend of mine used to run a doctor's office here. I maintain the building for him. It's private though. We have the place to ourselves." Weird. Okay. He shut the back door and locked it with a keyed deadbolt, the kind that you need a key to open, even from the inside, and put his keys back in his pocket, saying, "So, what do you want to do?" At this point, my danger sense spiked. This is not a normal home, and why is he locking the door like that? It's not necessarily suspect. A lot of people have this sort of lock on their door, and the door has a window, so it even makes sense. Still, something is not right. I can tell, and now I'm locked in. I asked him why he's putting the lock on the door like that, which immediately flustered him. He was looking rather nervous, and his voice was a little wavery and halting. Not quite stuttering, but almost. He said, well, we don't want someone to come in and interrupt us, right?" Flashing a weak, unconvincing smile. His demeanor and body language were all I needed to confirm that this guy was up to no good. Or at least there was something he was hiding. However, I could tell that I was intimidating him. I was not particularly muscular kid, but I have a larger frame. Like, even when I'm at my very thinnest, I will still wear size L tops and 36 waist pants, so I look pretty big, which people tend to interpret me as being strong than I really am. Also, I'm not a tough guy at all, but I have a resting facial expression that makes me look like a badass thug. People who don't know me often assume that I'm rough or something. I sometimes use this to my advantage while I can, because before long, a new acquaintance will eventually figure out that I'm a total wimp, lol. But this was definitely an occasion to play up the tough guy appearance, and I did exactly that. I put on my best steely face and told him to unlock the door, and that I don't want to be locked in here. He looked for a moment like he was going to pee his pants, then he said, "Okay, all right, I'll unlock this." He unlocked the deadbolt, and I'll just lock the knob here. And he turned the little dial that locks the doorknob. That was fine with me. I continued to stare at him until he said, "I'll leave the keys on the counter right here." And he set the keys down near the sink. I was relatively satisfied with that answer. At this point, though, my adrenaline was flowing. I was almost in full flight or fight mode, but I was kind of stuck in place. The guy was between me and the door, and I was freaked out, but this little weasel did not appear to pose any immediate physical threat to me. I could tell that his pants pocket were empty and that I was intimidating the living hell out of him. I don't know yet exactly what to do. Now keep in mind that despite my wordy descriptions, this all happened very quickly, without any long pauses. It had only been maybe 1 or 2 minutes since I had stepped in the door. This all happened at the pace of a conversation. The guy was obviously nervous and trying not to appear so. He said, "Well, let's go in," and walked a wide path around me through the kitchen into what would normally be the living room, and towards the hall to the right from there. I was familiar with this floor layout. It is very common in this area. The hallway would lead to 2 small bedrooms with a bathroom in between them. I hesitated, thinking I should just walk out that back door and take off, but really, now I was super curious. I knew there's no way in hell I'm doing anything with this guy, but I kind of want to see what's going on in here. Also, I'm confident that he can't take me if it comes to a fight, so I slowly headed towards the living room. It felt like I was walking in slow motion. From the kitchen entrance, I could see a large rectangular stainless steel table taking up a lot of the living room. I remember thinking this looks like a surgical table. It looks like it could rise and tilt, and it had a recessed channel running all the way around the edge. In hindsight, I now know what that is. It was 100% a mortician's table. Dude, has a mortician's table in here. But at the same time, I thought it looked like a medical table of some sort. There was some other office type cabinets and stuff around, I think, but now all I really remember is the table in that room. The large front window looking out into the street was covered by vertical blinds that were closed. SG65 said something like, "This used to be a doctor's office. Like I said, come on back here." The hallway revealed the room setup that I expected. The first bedroom door was closed. The second door was open to the small, very clean bathroom. At the end of the hall was the other bedroom, which looked like if the doctor's office story was true, had at one time been converted to an exam room. He said, "We can go in that room if you want. Go ahead, take a look." And he stayed by the other closed bedroom door. The back bedroom door was open, and I could see that the walls were covered in a honey-colored wood paneling, the type you might see in a den or office that hasn't been updated since the early 1970s. I slowly took a few steps down to that door, trying to be very aware of what Mr. Creepy was doing behind me. He didn't move. When I got up to that room, and the first thing I noticed was the door had a keyed deadbolt lock, like the back door. This room locked from the outside. I wonder if there was a lever on the inside, but I pretty much knew the answer to the question without needing to check. I also saw a chair, a non-swiveling plastic desk chair with thin metal legs, sitting near the center of the room. The room had old, dark carpet and those wood-paneled walls. I noticed that the walls were completely paneled with no windows, and I know that room had at least one window, probably two. So whoever did that paneling went over the windows. There was also a phone in there, plugged in, and sitting on the floor. It was an old office phone, probably from the 80s or early 90s. Dingy beige plastic with several buttons to manage different phone lines. Just sitting on the carpet near the wall, with the chair at a slight distance facing the phone. There was nothing else in that room. I was standing at the threshold of the room with one foot slightly in, absolutely not going past that door. I looked back at the dude. He was still standing by the other door, just nervously smiling at me, trying hard to look casual, but obviously very nervous or something. He said something like, "Well, what do you want to do?" Instead of answering, I felt around the backside of the deadbolt lock. Sure enough, nothing there but the smooth wood of the door. It also dawned on me that I did not see a light switch anywhere for the ceiling lamp. Where was the switch? Who knows? It should have been just inside the door, of course, but that original switch was covered up by the paneling. He mumbled something about not having the key to the lock. Don't worry about it. I turned back to face the guy and just said, "What is it that you want to do here?" My face had gone ice cold as I realized that I was way too far into this apartment. I was running through my options in my head. What is this guy gonna do? He doesn't appear to have any weapon or anything in reach, but who the fuck knows what goes on in this place? "What are you trying to do?" He was almost totally derailed by that. He stammered out, "Some hot man-to-man fun?" With the weakest smile I've ever seen, looking like he's just a hair's breadth away from panicking. That sounds comical, but really that sentence was probably the most chilling part of the entire experience for me. It was the way he said it, like he had to come up with something on the fly, something that would sound plausible, but Andy failed. Who says that in real life? Hey, do you have some hot man-to-man fun? Nobody. It's something you'd see on an advertisement for a cheesy porn site or something. Some hot man-to-man fun? Smile? Quivering lips? That was it. I said, "Nope, I want to go. I'm leaving." He said, okay. I quickly walked past him as he flattened himself against the wall to avoid me. And I noped right out of the kitchen room, dissection area, and through the kitchen to the back door, which was thankfully still not deadbolted. The keys were still on the counter. I let myself out the door and didn't bother closing that. As I saw him slowly coming to the door behind me, I deliberately walked, not ran, to my car. Looking back at the building, I could see that indeed there was a window facing the backyard area from that paneled room. But of course, it was covered up from the inside. Dude was shutting and locking the back door, and I left, heart pounding, skin icy cold, thinking, holy fuck, what was that. So, was this guy some kind of killer? Or was he just an awkward, closeted gay guy with access to a sterile looking apartment with an autopsy or mortuary table, in a windowless room that locks from the outside, with a chair and a phone and no light switch? It's clear to me that that poor soul who walks in that room gets locked in. He probably shuts off the light from somewhere and calls the phone. Other than that, it's anyone's guess what happens. I assume the friend of the judgmental person who emailed me must have been some kid that got locked in for whatever game ensues. Driving home, at first I thought, of course I have to call the police and tell them what's in that place, but thinking it through, I realized I didn't really have any crime to tell them about. I went to meet a man for casual sex, and what? He has a room with a chair in it? He has, as I thought at the time, an exam table? The police aren't going to do anything with that story. The guy didn't touch me or do anything to me, and I left. I considered calling an anonymous tip line, but again, what exactly would I report? There was no actionable crime. Also, keep in mind that at the time, while the local police in the city were pretty decent, they weren't especially interested in getting involved with helping the gays. They'd prosecute actual crimes if it was cut and dry, but I'd heard plenty of accounts of them not choosing to follow up on cases where they were not an easy arrest to be made. I decided not to report anything because nothing would come of it except drawing unwanted attention to myself. Even in retrospect, I think that was probably the most rational choice to make. If this happened today in 2020, the law enforcement would probably be a lot more interested in it. But back then, not so much. So live and learn. I still drove past that house once in a while in the normal course of life for several years, and I'd pay attention to how it looked. The vertical blinds were closed for maybe 5 to 6 years whenever I passed. Then eventually the blinds were down, and there were decorative curtains in the house, so I assume the place was eventually sold to someone who actually lived in it. Around 2002, maybe 2003, there was a murder of a young man on the news. He'd been found in the next state, which borders on my city, so it's not very far away. I recognized the guy from the gay community, but didn't know him personally. A friend mentioned to me something about the local serial killer. I said, "What?" He explained that a few young men had gone missing over the past year, each after at one specific dive bar, and each being found several miles to the north past the state line and out in the country. The case on the news matched up with the MO. My friend told me that the young guy had been at the bar and left with someone that night until he disappeared. The news report didn't mention anything about a gay bar or similar recent cases, of course. I had to wonder if my acquaintance from the internet had anything to do with it. The location of the murders apparently was nowhere near that duplex, at least according to the story I was told. I never heard of a resolution to that murder on the news or any official mention of a suspected serial killer, other than some gossip. So, that happened. I did time with the world's most unknown serial killer. Hi everyone, I'm an ex-con and not very computer literate, but I stumbled on this website and have been enjoying reading everyone's stories, so thought I'd share my own. I served a 10-year prison sentence between 2001 through 2011, and possibly, I met a man who would be considered the world's most unknown serial killer. It was back in 2011, when I had about 6 months left on my sentence, and I won't disclose his name for obvious reasons, but we shared a cell for those last 6 months. He was in for fraud. A 3-year stretch, it might have been more, can't remember. He was in his late 50s and, to put things simply, didn't look like no con. Skinny, glasses, and always reading a book. At yard time, he would always be playing chess, and I heard he never lost a game in all the time he was there. Anyway, I didn't really speak to him much at the start, but after I told him I was getting out and was struggling with some paperwork, not the best at writing, he helped me out. I was grateful, and afterwards we became more friendly. But it was the night before my release that he told me his own story. I got hold of some moonshine, and we started drinking and swapping stories like you do in prison, mostly bravado and bigging yourself up. Well, I must admit, we got pretty drunk, and that was when he told me his story. Now, at the time, like you're reading this, I thought it was all a bunch of bullshit. We were drunk and I didn't believe a word, just thought it was a deranged man rambling. But once I had got out, well, let me tell you his story first and what I found out afterwards. He confessed that night that between 1970 and 2010, he'd killed 155 people. He told me that he killed his first victim when he was 23, but knew it was what he wanted to do for the rest of his life by the time he turned 15. Just said it was his calling, like that's of a priesthood. He said he found his particular specialty were roads, mainly motorways. He'd wait in the rest stops in the dark, waiting for someone to pull in. Drunks were his particular favorite, the easiest of kills, like taking candy from a baby. They'd be snoring in the front seat of the rest stop, trying to snooze off their 10 beers before they got caught by the police, and he said he'd watch them while they slept, their heads pressed against the headrest, mouths open as they rested. He told me it became too easy, driving across the country, waiting for drunks. It got boring, so he graduated to couples. His favorite were university couples, young, sweet things with the whole life ahead of them. It gave him an incredible buzz to take a life with so much potential. They'd drive out to a nearby highway rest stop to make love, and in the darkness, he'd watch them before getting to work. Afterwards, he told me he used to videotape the news report, which always showed the pretty young blonde smiling at him from the TV. Then they would show the visuals, candles in the hands of those who were thankful it wasn't them, a crying parent, a teacher who barely knew the students speaking about their potential greatness, a potential that would never come to be. He used to categorize the news reports and play his favorites at night, like how you would put on a movie. He'd sit down with pizza and wine and watch those news reports, reminiscing about different victims over the years. Now, of course, I didn't believe a word of it. Who would have? We were drunk, and by the time we had finished, I felt pretty sick about it all. Of course, I wanted to smash his face in, but I couldn't. I was getting out in the morning, and he knew that. And later on, I guess that's why he told me. He was teasing me. Well, anyways, it was the last part he told me that made me wonder. There was a girl murdered in the 90s called Alicia Blank. I can't reveal her full name, but you can Google it, and it'll come up in the article. Everyone knew that case. It was a big story in my country, but that night he told me it was him that committed the murder. He asked me if I wanted to know where the body was buried. I told him he was a sick blank, but he told me the location anyway. You should have seen the smile on his face. It was like all this time he has been playing a game with me, waiting for the night I was got out to tell me. Test me, sort of. In the morning, he only stared at me blankly as I left my cell. And let me tell you, I've been around murderers and gangsters all my life, but that look on his face was something else. I can still picture it sometimes when I close my eyes. Those cold, dark eyes. And then for the next 6 months after my release, I thought what he had told me about the famous killing, the location of that poor girl. I would even find myself in the middle of the night trying to find more information about the case, cross-checking what the man had said. It came to the point where I started suffering from deep anxiety about it all. Of course, I would never go to the police since I'm old school, but I don't know, it sometimes gets to me. I reckon he was just lying, but I thought I'd get the story off my chest. Anyway, I've enjoyed reading your guys' stories, so thought I'd share my own. I continue looking forward to reading other stories as it helps my anxiety. Thank you for reading, and God bless. My son told me he was a serial killer. I believe him. People look at me strange when I tell them that I have an 18-year-old son. I'm 33. When James and I go out, it isn't uncommon for people to ask me if he's my little brother. He could easily pass for being in his 20s, and so could I. The past 18 years haven't been out without their trials, but I like to think I did my best I could given the situation. During my freshman year of high school, I knocked up my girlfriend. Her parents were going to put the baby up for my adoption, and my mom stepped in and helped me get custody. My son is a straight A student. He is a point guard for the school basketball team. I scrounged together enough money to get him a halfway decent car. He's popular in all the ways I wasn't. By the time I was his age, I had a 2-year-old son, a GED, and a job at the local pellet factory. We live in a 2-bedroom apartment duplex a few blocks away from his high school. He does his homework without much prompting and spends his downtime with friends or in the living room kicking my ass at Call of Duty. At one point, I thought he might be gay. I wouldn't have cared, but I thought it was weird that a boy his age had never had a girlfriend. I asked him about it, and he smiled, saying, "No, Dad, I'm not gay. I just wanted to wait until I'm a little bit older to get out there. Wouldn't want you to be a grandfather in your 30s. That was our sex talk." Between the internet and the sex ed class I had to sign a permission slip for, I figured he knew the basics. A few months ago, he told me he was going out late. When I asked why he told me that he had a date, I didn't ask any questions. I slipped him a $100 bill and told him to be home in time for breakfast. He was a good kid. I trusted him. After that, it became a semi-regular thing. He'd let me know on Friday afternoon that he was going to be out late that night. Each Saturday morning, he'd be home and sit on the couch playing on the Xbox before I climbed out of bed. I never met any of his dates, but I figured he was keeping it to himself. Like I said, I trusted my son. He had a good head on his shoulders, and I had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. I don't normally watch the news. Between my Facebook feed and Twitter, I usually knew enough about current events not to care. For whatever reasons, I found myself sitting in front of the television at 5 in the afternoon and decided to watch the news. I kinda wish I hadn't. The television switched from a commercial to showing the acre sitting there with a somber face. She looked at the camera and said, "Later tonight, we'll be covering a development story. Several area women are still missing as police look for clues as to whether or not the disappearances might be related. We lived in a sleepy little town. The idea that something like that could be happening so close to home shook me a little. The idea that my son could be out and about with something like that happening in town scared me a little too much. I talked to him about it. He told me not to worry. James was a big kid. He stood just under 7 feet tall and had a wide frame. I wasn't worried about someone getting the jump on him. But as a big guy myself, I knew that having a large frame meant very little if someone had a gun. James assured me that I had nothing to worry about. Just to be safe, I swiped his cell phone while he was asleep. I installed an app that allowed me to see his location at all times. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I remember being 17 and thinking that I was invincible. I didn't give it much thought. After setting the app to hidden mode, I put it back on the charger in the kitchen and didn't pay it much mind after that. I figured if I ever got worried while he was out, I could pull up an app on my phone and see his location. As long as it wasn't too out of sorts, I'd relax and go back to watching Netflix. I started following the case of the missing woman online. It was developing into a bit of a media sensation in our area. 6 women had gone missing over the course of 10 weeks. They varied in age and appearance. No bodies had been recovered, but police were operating under the assumption that foul play might be involved. When the 7th woman went missing, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't seen Rochelle in 10 years. She came back around when James was about 7. She tried to do mother thing but didn't have the chops for it. After a few months of broken promises and missed appointments, I got filed a motion for the court to do a drug test. After she failed the test, I had my lawyer file another motion stripping her of any visitation with our son. I didn't want my son to have to deal with that. It was Saturday morning and I was very apprehensive about going downstairs. James and I didn't talk about his mother much. She had spiraled out of control after giving birth to him and used just about any drug she could trade her body for. By the time she had come around to visit him, she had aged 20 years and only 7. Her arms were covered in track marks and her teeth were yellow to the point of decay. To be honest, I was surprised she stayed alive long enough to be abducted. With a heavy heart, I approached my son in the living room and said, "Son, we need to talk about your mother." James sighed and paused his game. He looked up at me and said, "What did she do this time?" I sighed and said, "She went missing last night. Police say there were signs of struggle at her trailer." James stared at the television like he was looking through it and unpaused his game. He continued looking forward and said, "Yeah? Well, that really isn't news, is it?" James and I didn't talk about his mother because he didn't like talking about her. One of the main reasons I involved a lawyer was because during one of her trips, she picked him up and took him over to her apartment. Apparently, she had a few customers come by while my son sat on the couch. His first real visit with his mother turned into junkies sitting next to him on the couch as they plowed $20 a pop to nail his mother. 3 hours later, a guy James called Steven dropped him off at the house. He was there when I got off at work. I asked him what happened, and all he would say is his mother didn't want him there anymore. He had sat outside with a jacket for 4 hours. Of all the things that could have happened to him, I was relieved more than anything that it had been so minor. I'd heard horror stories about situations like which ended in much more gruesome outcomes. I immediately put James into therapy after that. Within a few years, his effect turned to normal, and the visits to his therapist became less frequent. Up until that night, he had asked me about the mother about once every couple months. In the time since, I think he might have brought her up once. The following week, he let me know he was going out on another date. My penned-up worry manifested that night in pulling up an app on my phone. He drove down to a random address on the other side of town and then out to a spot in the middle of nowhere. I installed the app several weeks prior and didn't give it much thought. However, I hadn't been aware that it had been tracking his movements. According to the logs, he had been to that location in the middle of nowhere at least 4 times in the previous 6 weeks. I looked over his stops and his routes and noticed that one of the places he had been was Rochelle's trailer that night she went missing. I was suspicious but unwilling to grasp what every cell in my brain would have been shouting at me if I was any other kid. I threw my phone onto my bed and pulled out a bottle of whiskey from my nightstand. I drank myself to sleep and woke groggy the next morning. James was downstairs playing Dark Souls and eating a Pop-Tart. I knocked back a Red Bull and stumbled out to my car. I decided to go out to the spot in the middle of nowhere and check out where my son had been taking his dates. I really wish I hadn't. I really wish I hadn't. My GPS led me to the gravel road that had fallen into disrepair. After driving down it for a quarter mile with dense forest on either side, it opened up to a clearing with a small pond. I pulled up to the edge of the gravel and got out of my car. I could see remnants of a campfire near the pond. I walked over to it. The ashes were still warm. I sighed with relief. My son had found a quiet field with a pond in the middle of nowhere and was swooning his dates under the stars. I was almost proud of him, and then I noticed the footprints leading towards the pond. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy to the edge of the water. I walked closer to the edge of the water and stared into the murky water. I turned back towards the fire pit and noticed bloodstains on the grass behind me. With some trepidation, I waded into the water, and about 10 feet out, my worst fears were confirmed. I stepped on something hard. I reached down to feel it, and it was a thick logging chain. I pulled up on it and revealed a waterlogged body wrapped in a blanket. I pulled away the cloth to reveal a bloated face. It was Rochelle. I quickly wrapped her body back up and pushed it under the water. I ran back to my car and sped home. I sat in the driveway for 15 minutes trying to figure out if I was having a panic attack or a heart attack. My heart pounded in my chest so hard that it hurt. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to rationalize what I found. I tried to convince myself of 50 different conspiracy theories that explained why my son was innocent. Someone knocked on the driver's side window of my car, and I about jumped out of my skin. It was James. I climbed out of it hesitantly, and he immediately wrapped his arms around me, saying, "Whatever it is, it's okay, Dad. Just tell me what happened." He was such a good son. For a brief moment, I forgot about the pond and his mother's body. I followed him inside, and after changing into some dry clothes, I joined him in the living room. I sat in my easy chair as he sat across from me on the couch. After a few minutes of silence, I stared at the floor and said, "I found your mother." He responded, "Oh." I don't know what I expected him to say, but his response hit me hard. It wasn't surprise or even anger. It was the same flat effect he showed on the rare occasions I had caught him doing something he wasn't supposed to do. I looked right at him and said, "Please tell me you didn't do anything stupid, son." He looked off to the side and said, "Define stupid." I raised my voice a little. "God damn it, James, did he kill your mother?" He laughed and said, "The bitch was dead a long time before I clocked her over the head and dragged her to my car. Any bitch that would try to sell her son for dope has been dead for a long time." I couldn't speak. I'd always wondered about that night, but James never really talked about it. James continued, "You know, really, I lucked out. The bastard that paid for me to give me a ride home and told me never to go back to my mother, I guess it could have been a lot worse, but really that was the day I snapped. I understood how meaningless life was. Of course I killed her. That bitch deserved to die 6 times over." Tears filled my eyes as my son confessed to more than 15 murders. I sat there dumbfounded as he gave details and descriptions that no child his age should have been able to produce. When he finished telling me everything, I just sat there. What could I say? What should I have said? My son confessed to being a serial killer, and the only thought going through my head was trying to figure out how to make sure it didn't ruin his life. I finally worked up the nerve to say, "We need to get you help, son. This isn't healthy." James cut me off. "No therapists are going to help me, Dad. You've been good to me, so I'll spare you the bullshit. We both know that I turn 18 in about a month. I'll be out of your hair. Besides, I have bigger plans." I stared at my son and tried to wrap my mind around the beautiful monster he had become. 17 years of being his parent, and I had never in a million years imagined that he would turn out so broken. I quit my job about a week later. By his 18th birthday, I'd burned through most of my savings drinking and trying to forget what I had learned. Sure enough, the day after his 18th birthday, he was gone. Any part of me that held hope for him was lost a few weeks later when police discovered the bodies in the pond. By that point, he was long gone. I received a postcard a few weeks ago. It was a picture of a sandy beach. On the back were the words, "Hey Dad, just letting you know I'm fine." I tossed it on the table next to the door and went back to drinking. Part of me wants to go to the police and tell him everything. It probably wouldn't be that hard to track him down. Still, he's my son. I'm willing to do plenty of things, but serving my son up for crimes that would land him on death row sits outside my level of civic duty. The guilt gets a little worse every day. For now, all I can do is hope that he really is fine. I have no idea where he is. I don't want to know. All I can do is hope that he stopped killing. He really was a good boy. He's tall and charismatic. I'm sure he'd make it big if he just tried. And alright guys, that wraps up Reddit serial killer encounters. This was a pretty spooky video. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. And thank you so much for watching to the end of the video. It means a lot. And make sure you like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a lot. And yeah, until next time, see ya.